Fake HOA security tried to evict me, but they didn't know who was inside my cabin. It started with the crunch of boots on gravel outside my old mountain gate. I had just poured myself a steaming mug of black coffee, the kind that smells like smoke and pine, when I noticed shadows moving through the morning haze. 4 bulky men in matching black polos came marching up the drive, their mirrored sunglasses reflecting the rising sun. Each of them had cheap metal badges pinned crooked on their shirts, the words, "Community Security," barely legible. And behind them, strutting like a queen in a red blazer and heels that didn't belong on a dirt road, came Brenda. Clipboard clutched to her chest like a weapon, lips pressed thin like she'd been waiting her whole life for this moment. One of the men puffed out his chest, rattled the gate lock and barked, "Open up. This property is under HOA authority." I nearly spit my coffee back into the mug. Authority here, on my land. The morning air, which had been so peaceful seconds ago, suddenly felt thick. The mountain breeze carried the faint scent of bacon I'd left sizzling in a pan inside the cabin. Birds scattered from the trees, startled by the shouting. And there I was, standing barefoot on my porch, staring at this bizarre parade of fake uniforms and cheap intimidation. Brenda's voice cut through the air like a rusted saw. "You're in violation, Eric. This cabin is an eyesore, an illegal structure. You're trespassing on land that falls under my HOA." I leaned against the porch post, mug in hand, and raised an eyebrow. Trespassing on my own land. It would have been laughable if the situation hadn't carried a sharp undercurrent of menace. Those men weren't just standing there for show. They were flexing their arms, cracking their knuckles, gripping the bars of my gate like they might rip it open. It was intimidation, plain and simple. What Brenda didn't know, what none of them realized, was that I wasn't alone. Inside the cabin, still asleep after a long night of whiskey and card games, were my cousins, Jack and Daniel, both Army vets, both built like they'd been carved from oak, and both men who didn't take kindly to strangers trespassing on family property. But before I get to that part, let me back up. When I first bought this cabin, tucked away on a ridge where the trees still outnumber people 1,000 to 1, it felt like my final victory over suburban hell. I'd spent years under HOA rule in the city, petty fines for leaving a pickup in the driveway, letters about grass height, nasty notes about trash bins visible from the street. The kind of nonsense that wears you down until you forget what peace feels like. This cabin was my escape. It wasn't fancy, just a log frame, a creaky porch that groaned when you stepped on the wrong board, and a stone chimney that needed patching. But it smelled like pine and wood smoke. At night, I could hear coyotes howling across the valley. In the mornings, the only sound was wind through the trees and the crackle of my fire. It was freedom, and I thought foolishly that I'd left the world of HOA madness behind. Then Brenda moved in. She lived just around the bend, in a gaudy McMansion that looked like it had been dropped out of a catalog. The forest had been bulldozed to make room for it, and her driveway was lined with perfect hedges trimmed into shapes that didn't belong in the wild. Every time I passed her house, she'd glare at me like I was some intruder who'd ruined her view. Her problem was simple. My cabin wasn't part of her HOA. I didn't pay dues. I didn't attend her meetings. I didn't follow her rules. And that drove her insane. It started with letters, printed warnings stuffed under my gate about unsightly firewood piles, complaints that the sound of my chainsaw disturbed the neighborhood ambience. I tossed every one of them into the wood stove, where they burned better than kindling. Then came the envelopes with her HOA's logo, accusing me of refusing to pay dues to an organization I had never signed up for. I laughed, fed those to the fire too, and figured that would be the end of it. But Brenda wasn't the type to take no for an answer. So when the letters stopped working, she sent muscle. That morning, the sunlight glinted off the mirrored sunglasses of her so-called security team as they spread across my gate like they were staging a raid. One leaned against the hood of his rusty pickup, arms folded like he was auditioning for a bad action flick. Another rattled the gate padlock, as though intimidation alone would make it snap open. "Easy way or hard way?" one growled. I took a slow sip of coffee, let the silence hang heavy, then answered calmly. The only hard way you boys are walking into today is trespassing charges. This is my land. You've got no warrant, no authority, just a bossy woman with a clipboard and a bad attitude." The smirk on Brenda's face faltered just for a second before she snapped her heels into the gravel and shrieked, "I'll have you evicted. My security team has the right to remove you." Her security team shifted awkwardly. They looked less like enforcers and more like cousins roped into helping her move furniture. None of them seemed sure if they were supposed to drag me out or just nod menacingly. But I knew one thing they didn't. Inside the cabin, the floorboards creaked softly. Jack and Daniel were waking up, and when they stepped outside, this little performance of Brenda's was about to collapse in the most spectacular way. HOA security tried to intimidate me, but my army cousins had other plans. The screen door creaked, slow and heavy, like it always did when someone pushed it open too fast. A sound I knew better than my own heartbeat. I didn't even have to look over my shoulder to know who was stepping out. First came Jack, 6'4", built like a steel beam, his army t-shirt stretched across shoulders that could have carried half the cabin if it came down to it. He squinted at the men blocking our gate, the kind of squint that makes people wonder if they've just made the worst mistake of their lives. Right behind him was Daniel, shorter, stockier, but with arms thick as firewood and a jawline sharp enough to cut rope. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes, yawning like he'd just rolled out of a foxhole, then muttered, "What's all the noise about, cuz?" The fake security squad straightened immediately. For a moment, they looked less like tough guys and more like high school kids caught smoking behind the gym. Even Brenda froze, clutching her clipboard tighter, her painted nails tapping against the paper in rapid little bursts of frustration. "They're trespassing," she screeched, her voice pitched higher than normal, trying to sound commanding. "This cabin is illegal. My officers are here to remove him." Daniel laughed, a low rumble that made the men shuffle their boots in the gravel. "Illegal? Lady, this is his land. You're standing on it." "That's irrelevant," Brenda snapped, jabbing her clipboard toward the gate like a sword. "This community falls under HOA jurisdiction. These men have authority." Jack stepped forward, his boots crunching slow and deliberate against the porch steps until he towered over the scene. He crossed his arms, studying the mismatched uniforms, the crooked, security patches stitched like they'd been run off at a flea market. His voice was calm, steady, and just sharp enough to draw blood. "Officers, you boys look more like mall cops who lost their segways." That landed hard. A couple of the men muttered under their breath, cursing, but none of them stepped forward. Brenda's face flushed crimson. She tried to rally, raising her voice again, her red blazer glowing in the sun like a stop sign. "You will respect HOA authority. You can't just ignore the rules. There are 3 violations pending right now: illegal wood cutting, unregistered structure, unauthorized occupancy. He's trespassing in his own cabin." I couldn't help myself. I laughed out loud, the kind of laugh that rattles in your chest and won't stop once it starts. "Trespassing in my own cabin? Brenda, the only things trespassing here are you and your yard sale bodyguards." The leader of the fake security squad, a broad man with tattoos creeping up his neck, stepped closer to the gate. His mirrored sunglasses reflected my porch back at me. He tried to puff himself up, voice dropping low. "Watch your mouth, old man. We don't take disrespect lightly." I raised an eyebrow, sipping my coffee just to prove I wasn't rattled. "Old man, buddy, I've chopped logs bigger than you." That one hit. Daniel barked a laugh, slapping the porch rail, while Jack's lips curved into a grin that looked more like a wolf baring teeth. Brenda's fury was boiling now. She whipped open her clipboard, papers flying as she waved them in the air. "These are legal documents. You're bound by our bylaws whether you like it or not. If you don't comply, my security team will remove you." One of her officers spat into the gravel, another cracked his knuckles, but none of them actually moved closer. They were waiting for someone else to make the first step. Jack tilted his head, studying them like a drill sergeant watching raw recruits. "Remove him, That's what you signed up for, harassing landowners for HOA dues." Brenda snapped, "They're not harassing anyone, they're upholding order." Daniel leaned casually on the porch railing, his pocket knife flipping open with a metallic click. He started sharpening it, slow and deliberate, the sound carrying just enough to make every man at the gate hear it. "Funny," he said. "Back when we wore uniforms, order meant protecting people, not bullying them." The words hung in the air, heavy. One of the men shifted his weight, suddenly fascinated by the dirt at his boots. Another adjusted his cheap badge like it might somehow make him legitimate. Their leader, though, kept pressing, his voice shaking just enough to give him away. "We don't need county permission. HOA authority is higher." That broke me. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. "Higher than county authority? What's next? Going to tell me you outranked the sheriff? Maybe the governor?" Even Jack chuckled at that one, his deep laugh rolling across the porch like thunder. Brenda, however, didn't see the humor. Her face twisted, her lipstick smearing at the corner as she screeched, "Enough! Surround the property, don't let him leave." The trucks growled as her men revved their engines, pulling forward to block the gravel road like they were staging for a siege. Dust swirled around them, sunlight catching on dented bumpers and cracked windshields. I stood there, mug in one hand, calm as ever, because I knew something they didn't. The mountain wind shifted, carrying a faint, low rumble in the distance. At first, it was easy to mistake it for thunder, but I knew better, Jack knew better, Daniel knew better. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of Harleys. And when that sound rolled over the ridge, everything Brenda thought she controlled was about to slip through her manicured fingers. HOA officers tried to surround my cabin, but they didn't hear what was coming over the hill. The trucks shifted into gear, engines sputtering like angry dogs straining against their chains. Dust swirled into the morning air, coating the pines with a dull haze. The so-called security team fanned out in a crooked line across my gate, hands on hips, sunglasses tilted down just enough to glare. From where I stood, it looked less like a professional operation and more like a group of cousins playing dress-up as police officers. But the intimidation was real. Gravel crunched under their boots as they spread wide, blocking every inch of the road. Brenda marched to the center of it all, her red blazer glowing under the sun, clipboard raised high like it was a badge of divine authority. Her voice tore through the air, sharp and shrill. "You have no right to be here, Eric. You can't just build whatever you want, whenever you want. Your cabin is a violation of HOA bylaws, and you will comply." Jack chuckled under his breath, arms crossed, his frame casting a shadow across the porch steps. "Lady, this isn't your cul-de-sac. This is mountain country. Nobody asked for your bylaws." Brenda snapped her heels against the gravel so hard it sent tiny stones skittering. "Don't test me. I'll call the sheriff. He'll drag you out of here in handcuffs." That one nearly made me spill my coffee. I smirked, lifting the mug in salute. "You called the sheriff last month when I installed my mailbox, remember? He told you to leave me alone. Think he wants to waste another morning babysitting your clipboard." Her jaw tightened, cheeks flushing red, lipstick smearing at the corner from all the shouting. She turned on her men, barking orders like a general whose army wasn't quite sure they'd enlisted. "Block the driveway, don't let him leave. This is an official HOA action." The officers exchanged nervous glances. One leaned against his pickup, pretending to look tough while his hand trembled against the hood. Another lit a cigarette, the smoke curling around him in lazy rings. They wanted to appear unshaken, but their boots told the truth, scuffing, shuffling, grinding the gravel like they couldn't decide whether to stand firm or bolt. Daniel flicked open his pocket knife again, the metallic snap echoing louder than Brenda's shrieks. He dragged the blade lazily across a whetstone, sharpening it with exaggerated calm. "'Cuz," he muttered to me without looking up, "want us to handle this now." I shook my head slowly, a faint grin on my lips. "Not yet. Let them dig their own hole a little deeper." Brenda overheard, her eyes narrowing with triumph, mistaking my patience for fear. "That's right," she sneered. "You're cornered, you have nowhere to run. I've got the law on my side and you'll regret mocking me." The absurdity of it all was almost comical. Trucks sputtering like they might stall out at any moment. Grown men in knockoff uniforms playing bodyguard. A woman screaming HOA bylaws in the middle of a mountain ridge where the only witnesses were squirrels and a few startled deer. Or so I thought. Movement caught my eye down the road. A couple of neighbors had stepped quietly out from their porches, drawn by the racket. Phones in their hands, cameras already recording, they lingered near the tree line, pretending to be casual observers. One older man leaned on his fence post, shaking his head slowly, lips curled into the faintest grin. They weren't siding with Brenda. They were waiting for her to humiliate herself. And she didn't disappoint. From the back of her SUV, she pulled out a megaphone, bright orange, plastic, the kind you'd see at a high school football game. She raised it with trembling hands and barked into it, her voice amplified into a screech that rattled across the valley. Attention, you are in violation of HOA law. Comply immediately or face removal. This is your final warning. The sound bounced off the ridge, startling birds from the trees. Even her own security men winced at the volume, covering their ears with grimaces. Daniel chuckled low, spinning his knife shut with a click. She's officially lost it. Jack's laugh was deeper, rolling across the porch like distant thunder. Never thought I'd see someone declare war on a cabin with a megaphone. Brenda ignored them, voice cracking through the device. You can't chop wood without a permit. You can't park that truck unless it's registered with the board. You can't. I cut her off, raising my voice just enough to slice through her tirade. Brenda, do you hear yourself? You're screaming into a toy while trespassing on my land. Who's really breaking the law here? Her nostrils flared, her manicured finger stabbing the air in my direction. This isn't over. You think you can laugh at me? You'll regret mocking the HOA. But while she ranted, something else filled the silence between her words. A sound so faint at first, it could have been mistaken for the roll of distant thunder. A low vibration beneath the gravel. A hum that carried through the trees like a secret. My cousins heard it before anyone else. Jack's head tilted slightly, eyes narrowing toward the ridge. Daniel smirked, his hand tightening around his knife handle. The fake officers noticed it next. Cigarettes stilled, laughter died, their postures stiffened as the sound rolled closer. It wasn't thunder, and it sure wasn't traffic, not up here, not on this dead-end mountain road. It was the unmistakable roar of Harley engines, deep, guttural, growing louder by the second. Brenda faltered mid-scream, her megaphone lowering just enough to reveal the flicker of doubt in her eyes. She tried to cover it with another shriek, waving her clipboard like a shield. Ignore it, probably just locals. But her voice wavered. She didn't believe her own words. The neighbors watching from down the road exchanged knowing glances. One raised his phone higher, steadying the camera. They'd seen enough to understand what was about to happen. I smiled slowly, savoring the moment, my coffee mug still warm in my hand. Not locals, Brenda, family. The rumble grew louder, steadier, rolling over the ridge like war drums. Sunlight caught the faint shimmer of chrome through the trees, flashing in rhythm with the growl of engines. And for the first time that morning, Brenda's confidence cracked. Her red blazer suddenly looked less like authority and more like a warning flag waving in the wrong battle. HOA security thought they had me surrounded, but then the Harleys arrived. The ground itself began to tremble. At first, just faint vibrations under my bare feet on the porch boards. Then louder, heavier, until the gravel in my driveway rattled like loose bones in a tin can. That sound wasn't thunder. It wasn't traffic. It was the roar of Harley-Davidsons, deep, guttural, unapologetic, rolling over the ridge in perfect formation. Brenda froze mid-rant, her megaphone slipping to her side. For the first time since she showed up, her mouth hung open without words. The so-called security team shifted uneasily, tough guy postures cracking as they exchanged nervous glances. One man lowered his cigarette with a trembling hand. Another tugged at his crooked badge like it might suddenly give him courage. Jack leaned against the porch rail, his grin slow and steady, eyes locked on the horizon. Sounds like the cavalry's awake, he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by the men at the gate. Daniel snapped his pocket knife closed and slid it into his jeans. Right on schedule. I let a smile creep across my face, lifting my mug in a mock toast toward Brenda. Ever hear a war drum, Brenda? Because that's what you're listening to. Her jaw clenched, but her eyes betrayed the truth, fear. She stammered into the megaphone, It's just locals, nobody important. Locals, I raised an eyebrow. On a dead-end mountain road, try again. The sound grew louder still, splitting the morning air. Rev after rev, like thunderclaps tearing the sky apart. Dust rose from the far ridge as sunlight glinted off chrome. Black leather silhouettes cut through the trees, a dozen riders in tight formation, engines snarling like a steel hurricane. The neighbors down the road raised their phones higher, recording with giddy anticipation. One older man muttered just loud enough for others to hear, "Well, Brenda's finally done it. She picked the wrong fight." The fake officers weren't hiding their nerves anymore. One muttered, "Oh, hell no," and took a half step back. Another wiped sweat from his forehead, mumbling, "We didn't sign up for this." But Brenda, she doubled down. Her voice cracked through the megaphone, shrill and desperate. "Don't let them intimidate you. They're just bikers. This is HOA business." Her words were drowned out instantly. The Harleys crested the hill in perfect formation, sunlight bouncing off polished tanks, chrome glinting like lightning. Engines snarled in unison, tires spitting dust as they descended the road. It was a wall of leather, steel, and discipline, not chaos, but order of a kind Brenda could never understand. There must have been at least 12 of them, some with helmets, some bareheaded, their faces lined and weathered from years of service and miles of road. Military patches stitched proudly across their vests, scars visible on arms that had carried more weight than HOA bylaws ever could. The effect was instant. Brenda's fake army deflated. The swagger was gone. Their eyes darted from the approaching riders to each other, silently pleading for someone to decide whether they should stay or run. The riders slowed as they reached my gate, their formation fanning out across the road. Engines growled low, filling the valley with a vibration that rattled every window of my cabin. Dust swirled around them, sunlight catching on mirrored visors and black leather. Jack grinned like a wolf. Showtime. Kickstands slammed down in rhythm, one after another, metallic echoes cutting through the mountain air. The riders swung off their bikes in near unison, boots hitting gravel with weight that said everything words couldn't. At the front was my cousin David. He pulled off his helmet slowly, revealing a face weathered by desert sun and battlefield grit. His eyes scanned the scene, Brenda clutching her clipboard, trembling, the fake security squad sweating bullets, me leaning calm on the porch with a half-empty coffee mug. His voice was steady, low, and carried authority without a hint of shouting. "What's going on here?" Brenda, to her credit, tried to recover. She stepped forward, clipboard quivering in her hand. "These men, these bikers, are trespassing. This is HOA territory. They have no right to be here." David tilted his head, studying her like an insect under glass. He gestured at the cabin, the gate, the gravel road under our feet. "Funny, looks like private land to me." "It's private under HOA authority," she snapped. A ripple of laughter rolled through the riders, low and heavy, cutting through her words like a chainsaw through kindling. David smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Lady, I've been to countries where people claimed all kinds of authority. You know what mattered in the end? What was real? And what's real here is simple. You're trespassing on my cousin's land." Brenda sputtered, waving her clipboard like it might transform into a weapon. I have bylaws. I have jurisdiction." That was when Tommy stepped forward. A mountain of a man, tattoos of eagles and anchors crawling up his arms. He leaned down until Brenda had to crane her neck to look at him. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but sharp enough to cut. "Sweetheart, the only jurisdiction you've got is whether you want your latte iced or hot. So why don't you put the clipboard down before you hurt yourself?" Her face twisted, a mix of rage and humiliation. She whirled on her officers, shrieking through the megaphone. "Don't let them scare you. You're HOA security. You're stronger than they are." But her words fell flat. None of the men stepped forward. They looked at each other, then at the wall of leather and steel in front of them. The tough guy act was gone. What was left was fear. David took another step forward, boots grinding into gravel, his presence alone forcing the leader of Brenda's crew to tilt his chin up. "You call this security?" he asked, voice cold. "Back where we come from, security means protecting people, watching each other's backs, not bullying civilians for pocket change." Daniel barked out a laugh from the porch. "They're not even good at bullying. I've seen Girl Scouts with more backbone." The fake officers bristled, but none dared answer. Their leader adjusted his sunglasses with trembling hands, sweat dripping down his temple. And for the first time all morning, Brenda's empire began to crumble. HOA security tried to stand their ground, but they weren't ready for the Harleys. The valley went silent, except for the low, steady rumble of the Harleys idling in formation. It wasn't just noise, it was vibration. You could feel it in your ribs, in the glass panes of my cabin windows, even in the gravel trembling under our boots. Brenda's megaphone squealed as she raised it again, her voice shrill and desperate. "This is illegal. You can't just ride in here like you own the place. You'll all be arrested." Her words sounded pitiful against the growl of a dozen engines. Even her own security team flinched at the sound, their shoulders tightening like men wishing they were anywhere else. Jack leaned on the porch rail, his voice calm but sharp. "Hear that, fellas? That's freedom. Get used to it, it's not stopping anytime soon." Daniel chuckled, spinning his pocket knife between his fingers, the metallic click slicing through the air. "And if you think we're intimidating, just wait until these boys start talking." The Harleys cut off their engines in perfect unison, and the sudden silence was almost more terrifying than the roar had been. Dust settled around the riders as they dismounted, boots thudding heavy against the gravel. Shoulder to shoulder, leather vests marked with military patches, they formed a half-circle in front of the gate. Brenda's voice shrank to a squeak. This is noise pollution. I'll have every one of you fined." The men laughed, not a friendly laugh, dark, low, rolling laughter that carried weight, the kind of laugh that lets you know you've stepped way out of your depth. David, my cousin, stepped forward. He pulled off his gloves, tucking them into his belt, and locked eyes with Brenda. His tone was steady, firm, the kind of voice that doesn't need to shout. "No one here is intimidating your men. They're doing a fine job of scaring themselves." The fake officers shuffled, avoiding his gaze. One scratched his arm nervously, another muttered something about miscommunication. Their leader clenched his jaw, but his hands trembled as he adjusted his sunglasses. Brenda saw her control slipping. She slammed her clipboard against the gate bars, papers fluttering like wounded birds. "Listen to me. These men are criminals. If you don't stop them, the whole neighborhood will suffer." Tommy, the tattooed giant, stepped closer, his shadow falling across her. His voice was calm, almost pitying. "Lady, I've dealt with warlords who had more legitimacy than you, and you know what happened to them? They learned when it was time to walk away." Brenda's face twisted, but no words came out. Her hands trembled, the clipboard rattling against her thigh. The riders fired up their Harleys again. Engines roared like thunder, drowning her shrieks. Dust swirled in clouds, gravel rattled under the force, and the so-called security stumbled back, covering their ears. One of them shouted something about falling back, but his voice was lost in the storm. I stood on the porch, coffee mug raised like a toast, smiling. The message was clear without a single word. This land wasn't hers, and her little army had no power here. The riders killed the engines again, silence falling heavy over the ridge. The only sound was Brenda's ragged breathing and the faint chirp of a bird daring to return to the trees. David stepped forward once more, boots crunching slow and steady on the gravel. He looked the leader of the fake security crew dead in the eye. "You marched onto my cousin's property with trucks, fake badges, and threats. You already brought trouble. The question now is, how do you want to leave?" The leader swallowed hard. His lips parted, but no words came out. His men shifted from foot to foot, their pride dangling by a thread. Jack crossed his arms, grinning. "She still thinks she's in control, bless her heart." Daniel shook his head, his knife sliding shut with a snap. Not for much longer. The neighbors were still there, phones recording everything. From down the ridge, a voice called out, "Hey Brenda, your security looks like they're about to wet themselves." Laughter erupted from the tree line, raw and unfiltered. Brenda spun in a circle, shrieking into her megaphone. "Stop filming, this is official HOA business." But no one listened. The writers smirked, my cousins chuckled, the neighbors laughed louder. And in that moment, Brenda's authority, the clipboard, the megaphone, the hired muscle, was exposed for what it really was. Hollow, fake. David spread his arms slightly, his tone calm but cold. "You hear that silence, Brenda? That's the sound of nobody backing you up. Not your men, not your neighbors, not even the sheriff you keep threatening to call." Her lips trembled, her eyes darted like a trapped animal. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. Then the riders fired up their Harleys again, louder this time. Engines roared like a wall of thunder echoing off the valley walls. Dust rose, sunlight glinting off chrome, and the security men stumbled backward in panic. One muttered, "Not worth it," turned on his heel and headed for his truck. Another followed, then another. Brenda screeched, "Cowards, you're all fired." David smirked, his voice dripping with calm authority. "Fired from what? Pretending to be police." The laughter that followed wasn't just from the riders. It was from the neighbors, too. A sound that rolled across the ridge like a victory drum. Brenda was losing them, and she knew it. HOA security promised to remove me, but they ended up running for their lives. The engines thundered again, 12 Harleys roaring in unison like war drums that refused to stop. Dust swirled so thick in the air it looked like smoke rising from a battlefield. The valley shook with the vibration, and every single man in Brenda's little squad flinched. Their fake bravado was gone. All that swagger, all that chest puffing, it evaporated in the roar of real horsepower. One of them cracked first. He was the youngest, barely old enough to rent a truck. He muttered something that sounded like "to hell with this," and without another word, he turned on his heel, stomped back to his pickup, and fired up the engine. Gravel sprayed as he peeled out down the road, leaving nothing behind but a fatting trail of dust. The rest of the security team froze, eyes darting between their leader and the Harleys, as if waiting for someone to give them permission to run. "Don't you dare move," Brenda shrieked into her megaphone, her voice splintering. "Stay where you are, you work for me." But her words didn't carry the weight she thought. Another officer muttered under his breath, shook his head, and climbed into his truck. A second later, his tires squealed as he fled, fishtailing on the gravel. The riders laughed, a rolling chorus that filled the valley, dark and mocking. The neighbors recording from the ridge cheered and clapped, their voices echoing like an audience at a boxing match. The leader of Brenda's crew, the one with the mirrored sunglasses and tattoos crawling up his neck, was still trying to hold on. His jaw was tight, his hands trembling on his belt. "Hold your ground," he barked, but his voice cracked halfway through, betraying the fear under his skin. David stepped closer, boots crunching on the gravel, towering over the flimsy gate. His voice was low, calm, steady as iron. "Son, you've got two choices. Drive away now or explain to the sheriff why you're trespassing on private property with a fake badge." The man's jaw clenched. His sunglasses slipped down his nose, exposing eyes wide with panic. For a moment I thought he might actually try to argue. But then the sound of another Harley revving, louder, sharper than the rest, snapped the last thread of his courage. He bolted. His truck door slammed, his engine sputtered to life, and within seconds he was racing down the mountain road, his taillights vanishing into the dust. That left only Brenda. She stood alone in her red blazer, her clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield. Her hair was frizzed from the wind, her lipstick smeared from all the screaming, and her eyes darted between the riders, the neighbors, and me still leaning casually on my porch rail with my coffee mug. Jack chuckled deep in his chest. "Well, that's her army gone AWOL." Daniel grinned, flipping his knife open again and dragging it across the whetstone. "Some army, didn't even last one round." The riders roared with laughter. Some clapped each other on the back, others shook their heads in disbelief. The sound rolled across the ridge like thunder. Brenda tried to recover, but her voice came out shrill, cracked. "This isn't over. You think you've won, but you've only made it worse for yourself." David didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He took another step closer, eyes locked on hers. Worse for him, he's got family, neighbors who respect him, a deed that says this land is his. What do you have, Brenda? A clipboard full of fake fines and a bruised ego. Her lips trembled. She jabbed her finger at me, her voice breaking. I'll call the sheriff. He'll arrest every one of you. I smirked, lifting my mug. Go ahead. Remember what he told you last time you dragged him up here. He owns that land. Leave him alone. Maybe this time he'll bring handcuffs, but not for me. That landed hard. The neighbors burst out laughing, one of them yelling, "Yeah, Brenda, call the sheriff again. We'll record that too." Phones stayed up, capturing every second of her humiliation. She spun toward them, her face crimson. "Stop filming. This is official HOA business." But no one stopped. If anything, the laughter grew louder. Even the writers smirked, shaking their heads. Tommy, the tattooed giant, crossed his arms and leaned forward, his shadow stretching over her. "Dangerous, ma'am. If we were dangerous, you wouldn't still be standing here." Her mouth opened, then closed. No words came out. Her hands shook so badly that the clipboard slipped and smacked against her thigh. And in that silence, the truth hit her. Her army was gone. Her neighbors were laughing. The sheriff wouldn't save her. And she was surrounded by veterans who didn't need to shout or wave paper to command respect. Daniel's voice cut through the quiet, sharp but amused. "Hey, cuz, maybe we should let her write us up for excessive intimidation." I laughed, shaking my head. "Don't forget noise pollution. These Harleys aren't exactly whisper quiet." That broke the writers into another round of laughter, their voices booming like a storm through the valley. Brenda's face twisted, humiliation carved deep into her features. She tried one last time to rally. "You'll all pay for this. I'll fine you thousands for every violation." David tilted his head, his expression calm but edged with steel. "Lady, the only fine you're facing today is the one written on your reputation, and you just bankrupted yourself." Her breath came in ragged gasps. She spun on her heel, nearly tripping on the gravel, and stormed toward her SUV. The writers didn't move. They just watched, silent, as she fumbled with her keys, slammed the door, and peeled away in a cloud of dust. The neighbors cheered, the writers clapped, my cousins laughed, and me, I just raised my empty mug in a quiet toast to the quiet mountain air returning at last. But deep down, I knew Brenda. This wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. HOA president tried one last time to break me, but the neighborhood finally turned on her. For 2 days after the standoff, the mountain was quiet again. The Harleys rolled back out in formation, neighbors went about their lives, and I got back to chopping wood in peace. But peace never lasted long with Brenda. On the third morning, I found an envelope taped to my mailbox. Bright orange, stamped in all caps, "Final notice of violation." The paper inside was 3 pages long, typed up in a shaky template that looked more like it was copied from the internet than drafted by a lawyer. Fines stacked one after another. Unauthorized woodcutting, $500. Unpermitted cabin structure, $2,500. Failure to comply with HOA directives, $10,000. At the bottom, scrawled in red ink, "Pay or face legal action. Brenda, HOA president." I stood there on the dirt road, the letter flapping in the morning breeze, and couldn't help but laugh. It wasn't the numbers. It wasn't even the absurdity of it all. It was just how pathetic it looked. After all the shouting, the fake officers, the trucks, the megaphone, this was all she had left. A piece of printer paper and a signature scrawled in lipstick red. I poured myself another coffee, sat on the porch, and let the chickens scratch at the gravel while I read it again. My cousins leaned over my shoulder, Jack chuckling low, Daniel shaking his head in disbelief. "10 grand, Jack smirked. "For what, breathing mountain air without her permission?" Daniel snorted, flicking open his knife to carve a curl of wood from a log. "She's charging you rent on your own land now." The absurdity was funny enough to me, but the neighbors didn't find it funny at all. Word spread fast, faster than I ever expected. Copies of the same orange letter showed up in 3 other mailboxes down the road. Brenda hadn't just come after me. She turned her pen on the whole ridge. By sundown, a crowd had gathered at the edge of my property. Not angry, not wild. Just tired. Men with dust on their boots, women holding kids on their hips, teenagers with phones ready to record. They carried their own orange letters, some folded and crumpled, others still crisp from the mailbox. One neighbor, an older man named Henry, lifted his paper into the air. "She fined me $2,000 for having chickens. Chickens! My family's had them for 40 years. HOA never said a word until now." Another woman, Maria, shook her head, her voice trembling with frustration. "She fined me for planting tomatoes in my own garden, said the fence was aesthetic. Who decides what's aesthetic out here? It's dirt and pine needles." Laughter rippled through the crowd, bitter but united. Phones were lifted higher, capturing every word. And then Brenda showed up. Her SUV screeched to a stop on the gravel, her red blazer glowing in the fading sunlight like a beacon of arrogance. She stepped out clutching another clipboard, her heels clicking against the stones, her voice pitched high to cut through the murmurs. "Enough," she shouted. "This is still HOA territory and you will comply. These fines are binding. If you don't pay, I'll put liens on your properties." The crowd groaned, a sound heavier than any Harley engine. Phones zoomed in. Children covered their ears. Nobody cheered her this time. I stayed quiet, sipping my coffee from the porch. This wasn't my fight anymore. This was the community. Henry raised his voice, clear and steady. "Brenda, you don't even have the right paperwork. The county clerk said your bylaws expired 5 years ago." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Brenda's face drained of color. Maria stepped forward, her toddler balanced on her hip. "We checked. You never renewed the charter. You've been running this place like a queen without a crown. Every fine you've written is worthless." Brenda's jaw dropped. She stammered, waving her clipboard wildly. That's not true. My authority is recognized. You're all just ungrateful. Without me, this neighborhood would fall apart." But no one believed her anymore. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, it was final. The sound of people who had finally seen through the mask. Jack leaned over from the porch, his voice low so only I could hear. "She's finished." Daniel grinned, snapping his knife shut. "Yeah, but she's the only one who doesn't know it yet." Brenda screamed louder, her words dissolving into shrieks. "I'll sue all of you, I'll," but the words never landed. They just floated away on the mountain breeze, ignored, forgotten. Phones kept recording. Neighbors kept shaking their heads. And somewhere deep down, Brenda must have felt the truth finally crack open inside her. She wasn't feared anymore. She was a punchline. I raised my mug one last time, a quiet salute to the valley. And in that silence, I realized something. Sometimes the loudest revenge isn't anger, or shouting, or even winning. It's simply letting the world see the bully collapse under the weight of their own noise. And Brenda, she was collapsing fast. HOA president tried to break me, but in the end, she destroyed herself. By the next week, the story wasn't just a neighborhood rumor. It was everywhere. The videos neighbors had recorded spread like wildfire. Clips of Brenda shrieking into her orange megaphone, threatening people with fake fines, ordering security that fled at the sound of Harleys. It all went online. First Facebook groups, then local community forums, and finally the county news site. Brenda's voice, once sharp and commanding, was now a meme. Kids on the ridge were mocking her through cardboard megaphones, chanting HOA authority, while their parents laughed. The county clerk's office confirmed what Maria had said. Brenda had never renewed the HOA charter. Legally, she had no power. None. Every fine she'd written, every notice she'd taped, every violation she'd screamed about, it was nothing more than paper and noise. She wasn't president of anything. She was just a woman with a clipboard and a desperate need to control what she couldn't. The fallout was fast. The few board members who had backed her resigned quietly, some even apologizing at the grocery store. "We thought she had the paperwork," one muttered to me, embarrassed. "We didn't know." The sheriff, the same one she'd threatened to call on me a dozen times, finally paid her a visit. This time the handcuffs were in his hands, but not for me. Trespassing, harassment, misuse of authority. The charges weren't huge, but the humiliation was. Watching her shoved into the back of that county cruiser, hair frizzed, blazer wrinkled, screaming about bylaws that didn't exist. It was like watching a storm finally run out of rain. The neighborhood changed after that. Henry's chickens scratched the dirt in peace. Maria planted twice as many tomatoes, her toddler toddling between the rows. Neighbors waved when they passed, not out of obligation but out of real relief. For the first time in years, people felt like they could breathe again. And me, I kept chopping wood. The gate still creaked every morning. My cousins still rode their Harleys up the ridge on weekends, engines rolling like thunder across the valley. Life went back to quiet. But sometimes, in the stillness of the evenings, when the sun painted the cabin in gold and the air smelled like pine and dust, I thought about Brenda. I thought about how far she'd gone. Fake officers, trucks, threats, fines, all to control something that was never hers. And I thought about how easily it all collapsed, not because I fought harder, not because my cousins roared in on steel horses, not even because the neighbors stood up. It collapsed because the truth has weight, and lies always collapse under their own noise. One night as we sat on the porch, Jack leaned back in his chair, sipping a beer, and said, "You know, cuz, she did you a favor." I raised an eyebrow. "How do you figure?" He grinned. "She brought the whole neighborhood together. Didn't mean to, but she did. Sometimes enemies are just teachers in ugly disguises." Daniel chuckled, flipping his knife open to carve at the railing. "And she taught us one hell of a lesson: never mess with family." We laughed, but in the quiet that followed, I let myself think a little deeper. Brenda wanted power, she wanted fear. She wanted people to bow to her clipboard and her voice. But what she never understood, what she couldn't understand, was that real strength doesn't scream. It doesn't bully. It doesn't need fake authority or cheap uniforms. Real strength sits quiet on a porch with coffee in hand, waiting. Real strength rides up a mountain road when family calls. Real strength is neighbors who finally say enough. And that's why, in the end, she never stood a chance. The ridge is quiet now. The chickens cluck, the creek runs, the gate creaks like it always has. Every sound is a reminder. Peace doesn't come from fighting every battle. It comes from standing your ground when it matters and letting the truth do the rest. Sometimes the strongest revenge is silence. And sometimes the sweetest victory is just watching the bully finally hear it. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.